Hi, my name is Anna Enan, and today I'm going to present to you the effect of the Mediterranean diet on cognitive function in older adults, a systematic review, and this is for the class Research Methods at Eastern Illinois University. First, I just want to present an outline for the presentation just so you have an idea of how we are going to go about the presentation and in what steps. So I'm first going to provide a brief introduction of my topic, then I'll go into the background of it just to give you some good understanding of the topic, and I'll move into my purpose statement for the presentation, and then we'll move into the literature review and synthesis so that we can understand this presentation further, and then I will end the presentation with some conclusions and implications for further research. So to begin today's presentation, I want to provide a brief introduction to give you some good background of the information that will be provided in further slides. So first we're going to go over the background of dementia, specifically Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, and we're just going to focus on those two parts of dementia today. And then we'll move into the Mediterranean diet and the components of that, but that's going to be very brief because as dietetic students we should know what that is. I just want to briefly cover that today. Next, I want to move into the background of dementia just to give you a good basis of what that means when I talk about this throughout the presentation today. So many of you probably know someone who suffered from dementia, or you've seen it in your workplace. Say you worked at a hospital and you've seen that there. But what is it exactly? So dementia is a decrease in cognitive abilities leading to functional decline and the inability to carry out usual activities of a cognitively healthy person. And this is according to Ramos et al. So dementia is actually on the rise because baby boomers have recently entered into older adulthood. So that means that chronic disease is also on the rise, hence dementia also rising. Currently, approximately 15 million people suffer from dementia, and there's really no particular treatment or cure for it that stops it from occurring or progressing even further. There is a diagnosis, there are some diagnostic tests that can be done, but it's really difficult to diagnose it completely. There's a neurological exam, a neuropsychological mental status exam, and an MRI can help to diagnose it. But for Alzheimer's disease, the only true diagnosis or diagnostic criteria for Alzheimer's disease is a brain biopsy, and that's not ethical. We cannot do that until someone passes. So it's difficult to truly diagnose someone with dementia. There are some signs and symptoms that can lead to diagnosing someone with dementia, but it is a difficult diagnosis. And then there are also some different disease states that can contribute or predispose someone to developing dementia. And this can include diabetes and hypertension. So just keep that in mind. And then also stroke can increase the likelihood of dementia. So those who have experienced a stroke-like event are actually twice as likely to develop dementia than those who have not. And there's also a cerebrovascular contribution to dementia. And what does cerebrovascular mean? So cerebro is referring to the large part of the brain, and vascular is referring to veins and arteries. So together this just means, this refers to the blood flow in the brain. And so whenever there's cerebrovascular disease, that means that blood flow in the brain is getting stopped or not working correctly or properly. So having a cerebrovascular risk factor or having a disease like atherosclerosis or stenosis or even a stroke can contribute to dementia as well. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. A cerebrovascular disease carries a high risk of cognitive impairment and dementia. So on the right here you can see that I have Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia and then other rarer types of dementia. Today we're going to cover Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, and there are a couple other types of dementia that uh, are important as well. However, they're not as common, and we're just going to focus on the Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia components today. So like I mentioned in my previous slide, there are many different types of dementia, and today we're just going to focus on Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. So as you can see here, it is the most common form of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and it affects approximately 5.2 million Americans and is predicted to triple by the year 2050. It has an unknown origin, but it is multifactorial, but there's no cure or treatment to alter the progressive course of it. And according to Dumas, women are at higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. In addition, the apolipoprotein E4 allele, which is written there as APOE4 allele, is present in approximately 14% of the population, and it's a heavy risk factor in developing Alzheimer's disease. But just because you have that allele does not mean that you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease affects the learning and memory parts of the brain, so being able to retain information and recall it, that's what Alzheimer's disease affects in the brain. And there are vascular mechanisms that may also critically contribute to the development and progression of Alzheimer's disease. Senile plaques and neurofibrillary tangles can be seen in the brain biopsies of individuals suffering or that suffered from Alzheimer's disease or dementia. That's seen in both of them. And then the signs and symptoms can be apathy, agitation, depression, delusions, confusion, forgetfulness, and there are a slew of other signs and symptoms. I just listed a few there. And vascular dementia, on the other hand, is the second most common form of dementia, and it is cerebrovascular disease that we just defined earlier, manifesting as dementia. So it has those cerebrovascular components to it. It also can be seen, senile plaques and neurofibrillary tangles can also be seen in the brain biopsies of people who suffer from dementia. And it is a stepwise process or continual decline, and that can be caused by many strokes happening over and over again. And it's, according to Mendez et al., there's a greater mental slowing in vascular dementia than in Alzheimer's disease. Some signs and symptoms of it include executive dysfunction, which refers to planning, attention focus, remembering instructions and juggling different tasks. And these skill sets allow the brain to filter distractions, to prioritize tasks, and to set and achieve goals, and also to control impulses. Then psychomotor slowness, gait imbalance, dysphagia, and mood changes. Risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. The red ones here you can read over. They are the modifiable to a certain extent risk factors. The black ones here are the ones that you cannot modify. So if you just want to read those over or pause on those, you can. But these are some things I already talked about previously. So next I just want to touch on the Mediterranean diet and the components of it. As most of us know, there's no single definition for the Mediterranean diet, but there are quite a few different components that most people agree on. First of all, a high intake of vegetables and fruits is usually part of the diet, as well as a high intake of grains, but mostly whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, unsaturated fatty acids, with olive oil being the main lipid source usually from the diet, moderate dairy consumption, low to moderate fish and poultry consumption, low red meat consumption, and then consuming wine with meals. So just want to tie in the Mediterranean diet and cardiovascular health and then into cognitive health as well. So Keyes in the 1950s actually discovered that the individuals living in Crete, Greece, and southern Italy consumed a high-fat diet. So they ate a lot of high-fat foods. However, there were low rates of coronary heart disease, and so he found that interesting, and that's where he came up with the concept of the Mediterranean diet that we pretty much know today. And it's the most likely dietary model to provide causal protection. And as you can see on the right here, I kind of tied these all together. So the Mediterranean diet can reduce arterial stiffness, which arterial stiffness can lead to that plaque formation and buildup in the arteries, its anti-atherogenic effect, which is kind of the same thing as the arterial stiffness, reduction in blood pressure, and one of the risk factors was hypertension for dementia, and then also it's anti-inflammatory. So next I want to move into my purpose of the presentation. My purpose is to provide an overview of the current data that evaluates the effect of the Mediterranean diet on cognitive function in older adults. And more specifically, I want to answer the question, does the Mediterranean diet have a protective effect against developing dementia? So now I'm going to move into the literature review where I talk about all of the articles that made it into the systematic review. So to begin the literature review process, I'm going to first start talking about the article retrieval process. So I utilized the Prisma model diagram, which allowed me to organize all of my data in a simple way so that I could tell where each source was coming from, and then it helped me to decide which sources were going to be evaluated in the systematic review. And through the Prisma method, there are 4 different stages in the method. So there's identification, screening, eligibility, and the included articles. So we'll go through those step by step. So this is the Prisma article that I used, and this is it all filled out. But through each slide, I will actually highlight the area that I'm going to talk about, and this is just a brief overview of it real quick. So for the first step in the Prisma method, identification, I determined which databases I was going to utilize to research my topic. So I used PubMed, EBSCOhost, which is from the EIU Booth Library online database, and then Deep Dive, which is, it's actually a database that you have to pay for, but they do have a 2-week free allowance where you can get all of the articles for free through there, and you can actually get full text articles. So many of the databases that I originally tried to find sources through, I couldn't get full text articles, so that's why I utilized Deep Dive as well. So this is the Prisma flow diagram, just showing the first step here. So the records that I identified through the database searching, so through all 3 databases, I came up with 423 different records. And I didn't use any additional records through other sources, so I left that as 0. So then the second step here is screening, and I utilized Mendeley, which is a database compilation of sorts, where you're able to compile all of your data into one database, and you're able to see if there are any duplicates. So I was able to remove my duplicates that way, and it made it really simple to also view the titles. So I was able to just scan through all of the titles and determine which ones met my criteria just based on the keywords in the title. And then I also read through the abstract after I removed the ones for the titles. I read through the abstracts, looked for keywords, and determined if it was going to be a good fit for my review. And just based on that, I will show you the Prisma diagram next. And I wanted to tell you the keywords that I used in my search were Mediterranean diet, cognitive health, cognitive decline, cognitive function, Alzheimer's disease, and dementia. And I ended up having quite a few excluded for duplicates, so 73 of them were considered duplicates. So that brought me down to 350 records after those duplicates were removed. I had a difficult time with my data sourcing because I feel like a lot of the titles that came back had nothing to do with my topic. So I also had to scan through those titles, and it was a process, but I got there. And then I had to exclude some articles based on the year Some of the databases, I think just one of them actually for me, did not allow me to screen for the year criteria. So everything from 2009 and newer is my inclusion criteria, but I had some articles dated in the 80s, so I had to exclude some of those. 149 of those actually were excluded from uh, the criteria due to them being too old. And then if you move down a little bit further there, you can see that I screened the rest of those records for the title and the abstract, and I had to exclude 150 of them because they did not meet my inclusion criteria just based on the title and the abstract. It was very clear to tell which ones were going to fit and which ones weren't. So then I move into the eligibility stage, and this is where I read through each of the articles, and I didn't necessarily read them all the way through. I read until I could tell if it was going to fit my criteria or not. And so I eliminated articles based on my inclusion and exclusion criteria, and if I was able to see the full text and was able to read the entire text through. So the eligibility, inclusion criteria, and exclusion criteria are as follows. All of the studies had to be primary studies, so they couldn't be secondary or any sort of review. They had to be peer-reviewed sources as well, so that was important to note, and that was kind of difficult to verify, but I verified that as well. All of them had to be dated from 2009 until the present. They couldn't be anything earlier than 2009. And then each of the articles had to have the Mediterranean diet somewhat explained. They didn't have to have it in depth, like major detail, but I did want it to have some sort of explanation as to what they viewed as the Mediterranean diet since it is a bit ambiguous. There's a lot of similarities, but there are some differences between what people think the Mediterranean diet is. So I wanted to make sure that that criteria was accounted for. And then all of the participants had to be 55 years of age or older, just based on this criteria. And then they could not have any cognitive dysfunction at baseline. So when they were first being screened, they couldn't have any sort of dementia or cognitive disability or anything of that sort. And then moving into my exclusion criteria, I was not, none of the articles could have been open access. So open access articles were not allowed in this review. They could not be older than 10 years old, as I stated before. No mention of the Mediterranean diet. That wasn't allowed in this as well, just because of the subjectivity of it. And they could not be less than 55 years of age, and no dementia or cognitive dysfunction at baseline, and then no systematic reviews were allowed either. So this is my next step in the Prisma flow method, and as you can see there were 51 full text articles that were assessed for eligibility. So these were the ones that were excluded for specific reasons. So there were two of them that I viewed that were open access articles that were no-no. They were not allowed to be reviewed for this systematic review. Four of them were just too narrow. They were focusing on really specific nutrients, and I didn't want to focus on just specific nutrients. I wanted it to be mostly Mediterranean diet focused. And then 35 of them, the full text was not available based on the database that I was using. I was not able to access the full text without payment. And then we'll move into the last steps here. So that left me with 10 different articles that I was able to review for this systematic review. And then lastly, we're going to move into the included articles, which is the last step of Prisma. So we figured out that there are 10 primary studies utilized in this review based on that Prisma diagram. And from there, I wanted to note some similarities and differences between all the studies. So many of the studies are very similar in their methodologies. However, there are many different locations in each of the studies. Some are done in the United States and some are done in different countries. And then there's also various demographic criteria between the studies. Some of the studies focus specifically on certain demographic criteria and others do not. And there's also different types of studies. Most of them follow the same study design, but there are some different types as well, and then various findings throughout the studies. So I just want to give you a brief overview of each of the 10 articles here. I'm just going to point out some specific areas here that I think are really important and point out some similarities and differences between the articles. So this was conducted in Spain, and it was from a cohort from previous time from the SUN project participants. So you'll see from most of these studies, they are conducted with previous cohorts, but they are prospective cohort studies because they're being conducted today and right now. They're basing some of their data on past studies, but they're still using that data to conduct these studies today, or the time frame of the study conducted. This is a pretty decent sample size of 823 participants, and their evaluation methods were very similar to many of the other studies that you'll see. The food frequency questionnaire, the med diet score, which is a 0 to 9 score to determine your adherence to a Mediterranean diet, and there's also cognitive function tests that are done by telephone, which is the TICS. This one is a modified version of that, but many of the studies do use the TICS for the cognitive function test. And that is actually a modification as well of the mini mental state examination, which you'll see in many of these articles too. And also anthropometrics and the hypertension status are both gathered from many of these studies just because we know that hypertension is a risk factor. And then also anthropometrics, knowing height and weight and BMI and relating those to the findings. So the findings here were that a higher cognitive decline was was associated with a low or moderate adherence to the Mediterranean diet. And then there's also a neuroprotective effect of the diet according to these findings. And then the high monounsaturated fatty acid to saturated fatty acid ratio showed that there was a neuroprotective effect of that as well. So this is Article 2, and it is conducted in Australia, as you can see here. It is a prospective cohort as well, and it's based on data from a previous study. And the sample size is a decent size of 527 participants. 39.8% of them were male. And they also conducted the same type of study as, or the same type of evaluation methods and measures as the last study did. They conducted a comprehensive neuropsychological assessment at baseline, at 18 months, and 36-month follow-up as well. And they also compiled a global cognitive score to determine cognitive function at baseline and at those different time periods. They took fasting blood samples as well to determine if the participants were ApoE4 allele carriers, and they adjusted the findings according to that. And then they also followed an OSMED-DI score, which is just, it's very similar to the Mediterranean diet score, but it is a little bit of a tweak on that based on their Australian Mediterranean diet modifications. So it's a little bit different, but that is very similar to the Med-DI score. And then the findings of this article are that the adherence to the OSMED-DI are associated with less decline in executive functioning in the ApoE4 allele carriers. Those are the people who are more prone to developing Alzheimer's disease based on their genetics. And then baseline adherence to a Western diet, so they evaluated a Western diet versus a Mediterranean diet, Western diet was associated with increased cognitive decline in visuospatial functioning in the ApoE4 allele carriers. And then Article 3 was conducted actually in the United States, and it was also a prospective cohort, and it was based on the Women's Antioxidant Cardiovascular Study participants. This was a pretty good sample size of 2,504 women, and these are on health professionals with prevalent vascular disease or greater than or equal to 3 coronary risk factors. So the evaluation methods here were that they gathered the medical history of the participants. They assessed their cognitive function using the TICS, which is that telephone cognitive uh, assessment. They also used a semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaire at baseline, and they determined the med diet score from that. And then they also conducted annual lifestyle health questionnaires just to keep up to date on these participants. And the findings were actually that there's no association observed between the adherence to the med style diet and cognitive decline across 5 years of follow-up. Article 4 was done in the United States as well, and it was based on the health and retirement study, and it is a population-based cross-sectional study, so it's not like the prospective cohorts. It's actually done at a specific time, so it's a little bit different in that respect. And the participant number was 5,907 participants. 60% of them were women and 78% of them were white. Evaluation methods are very similar. The only difference here is that they assessed immediate and delayed recall, and that was specific in the study here. And then they adjusted for covariates as well. The findings here were that a high adherence to med diet significantly was related to better cognitive performance. So that's a good finding there, and it's very significant. And then Article 5 was also based in the United States, and it's a prospective cohort across 8 years. And the participant size was about 2,326, and they had 38.2% Black participants and 51.3% female participants. The evaluation methods are very similar to the previous studies. They did include the geriatric depression scale to account for that as well, and they also use the 3 M's for the cognitive assessment, which is the modified mini mental state exam, and then they also did that at baseline to determine their cognitive function at baseline. The findings of this study were that whites had higher med diet scores, but the significant finding of this study was that Black participants with high med diet scores had a significantly slower rate of cognitive decline. Very interesting to see that. Article 6 is also conducted in the United States as a cross-sectional study, with 50% of the participants being minority and female. And they also use many of the same evaluation methods as previous studies did. They also use the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale to determine the stage of depression one is in, and then the Framingham Stroke Risk Profile to determine stroke risk. The findings of this study that are significant are that the high med diet group has significantly larger DNate gyrus volumes. So DNate gyrus volumes are part of the hippocampus, and they're thought to contribute to new episodic memories, and they're also important in learning and memory. And remember that learning and memory plays a role in Alzheimer's disease, and those are the two important parts of the brain that are majorly affected by Alzheimer's disease. The other significant finding here is that higher self-reported med diet scores exhibited better scores on learning and memory once again. So very interesting finding relating to Alzheimer's disease. So this study here, I don't have a whole lot I want to point out about it. It is another prospective cohort, but the findings here were that there was no evidence of association between the Mediterranean diet and cognitive performance, which is interesting to see this here. If you want to review this longer, you can, but that was just the main thing that I wanted to point out on this article. So this article is based on 16,000 women, so it's a pretty large study. It's also prospective. And it has quite a few significant findings. So the evaluation methods are pretty much the same as the ones previous, but it is based on an alternate Mediterranean diet as opposed to just the Mediterranean diet, and that means that they look at the monounsaturated fat to saturated fatty acid ratio, and they include everything else in the diet regularly, but they just have that ratio as well in there. But the findings here are that a higher long-term adherence to this diet are related to better performance on the TICS, which is that telephone cognitive assessment interview, the global cognitive, and the verbal memory score, which are pretty significant findings. And also something just to note that higher long-term vegetable intake related to less decline in global cognition, which I thought was very interesting. Article 9 here is a little small study, and it's a cross-sectional study conducted in Canada, and they had some interesting evaluation methods. They had a wayfinding task where the participants were asked to find specific landmarks in a virtual world, and they also had a 4-on-8 virtual maze. So this was trying to probe their minds, and afterwards they did a probe trial to see if they could remember where things were. And then the findings here were that a lower omega-6 to 3 fatty acid ratio was associated with higher overall cognitive status. So I thought that was a really interesting finding as well. So for our last article, it was conducted in Greece, which I think is perfect to end our studies on, just because it's in the Mediterranean area. And it was a prospective cohort over 401 participants and 144 men and 257 women. Many of the evaluation methods are similar to the previous studies. However, the socioeconomic status and medical and lifestyle factors were actually recorded by trained interviewers just to eliminate that barrier that may be there for participants. And then also a semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaire was obtained from participants. And when it says semi-quantitative, that means that these food frequency questionnaires collect portion size information as standardized portions or as a choice of portion sizes. So it's a little bit different than the regular food frequency questionnaire, but it is very, very similar. And then med diet score was achieved, and some of the findings that were significant include a closer adherence to med diet is associated with a less decline in the MMSE test performance. So that means that these individuals were able to recall information better when they were adhering to the diet closer. And then evidence compatible with protective effects of closer adherence to the Mediterranean diet on cognitive function. So the next step of this presentation is to provide a synthesis of the studies that I just went over briefly. So the total participants across all the studies include 34,848 participants. And the mean age between all those participants was 64 years old. Across all of these studies, the food frequency questionnaire was used by most of the studies, and it was the most widely used form of evaluation. In addition, the telephone interview of cognitive status was used by most studies as well, and it was used to determine the cognitive status of participants, and it also helped to eliminate the barrier of participants having to physically be there for that study because it was just conducted over the telephone. Anthropometrics were also gathered from participants in order to eliminate confounding factors, and lifestyle factors and health history was obtained to pair like with like, so doing the paired tests. And then lastly, most of the studies did use data from previous years or specific cohorts, like I mentioned before. So there's just a few significant findings that I'd like to go over based on the data that I just presented to you. First of all, there is a low monounsaturated fatty acid to saturated fatty acid ratio that's significantly associated with a higher decline of cognitive function. And remember that the Mediterranean diet is comprised of a higher monounsaturated fatty acid to saturated fatty acid ratio. And so that means that, or it could mean that the Mediterranean diet may have a protective effect against cognitive decline. Next, there's a positive relationship between the med diet adherence and better executive function performance in Gardner et al. There's also a high adherence to the Mediterranean diet, and it's significantly showing better cognitive performance than those with the mid or lower levels of the med diet adherence. In the study by Koyama et al., Black participants with high med diet scores had significantly slower mean rate of decline of the 3Ms score, which is the mini mental state exam, which evaluates cognitive function, and significantly slower rate of decline. And in the study from Carstens et al., the high med diet group had significantly better learning and memory composite scores, and that is referring to the possible development of Alzheimer's disease. So that means that the Mediterranean diet could lessen one's chances of developing Alzheimer's disease. And in that same study, the high med diet group had significantly larger DNate gyrus volumes, which means which refers to the hippocampus, which means that those individuals may have better memory. And then in this next study, a higher long-term vegetable intake was related to less decline in global cognition. And this is the only piece of information that's just one based on one food group, but I thought it was an interesting, significant finding. And then the last one here, that lower omega-6 to 3 ratio signifies better spatial memory. And spatial memory is the part of the memory that's responsible for recording of information about one's environment and spatial orientation. So although there were quite a few significant findings from this data, there are a couple of insignificant findings that I thought were worth mentioning. First of all, there was in the Carstens et al. Study, there was an insignificant tendency toward larger hippocampal volumes in the high compared to the low med diet group. That means that these individuals may have a better capability of memory, and that's interesting, but it's not conclusive because it was not significant in the study. The next one here is from Koyama et al. Study, and in that study, the med diet score was not significantly associated with cognitive decline in whites. Next, I just want to discuss the findings from the articles and the synthesis of those articles together. As we discussed earlier, the food frequency questionnaire was used quite often throughout each of the studies, and it is a great validated test to use for studies, especially in a nutritional study based on a specific diet. So that was used quite often, however, it was different across each of the studies. In addition, the study types were quite similar. Most of them were prospective studies. There were a couple cross-sectional ones thrown in there, but I do believe that the prospective cohort studies were the most significant and the most valid studies. In addition, the ApoE4 alleles were discussed among many of the different studies, and that was a specific criteria that they used in order to determine whether those individuals could see any sort of cognitive decline or any sort of cognitive impact from the Mediterranean diet in these studies. Next, the socioeconomic status, medical and lifestyle characteristics of each of these individuals were gathered through these studies. Most of them used this evaluation method. And then lastly, the cognitive function was assessed using the mini mental state exam or a modified version of that. And this was also conducted through the telephone interviews as well. So with a systematic review, there are a few strengths and limitations of it. First, on the strength side, on the left there are validated tests used throughout each of the studies, including the food frequency questionnaire, the telephone interview for cognitive assessment, and the med diet score. So those are all some decent tests that are validated and good for using in evaluation methods. In addition, large sample size was a positive as a strength of this systematic review. And there were over 39,000 participants overall in these studies. There are also longitudinal studies, most of these are, and that means that researchers are able to observe participants over a long period of time. And there was also reevaluation of participants over time. It wasn't just a one-time um, assessment or observation of participants. Researchers uh, met with or talked with participants over different designated time periods. So they're able to gather information throughout those time periods and average it, and then also able to pair them in a paired design with like information. And in addition, there were repeated measures, ANOVA conducted, which can allow for confounding information to be removed. And then on the limitation side, they are self-reported tests, which on the food frequency questionnaire. Um, so that can include some bias or confusion, and the participant can struggle with determining what they want to write down for their answers. Also, it's very subjective. The diet adherence, sometimes individuals will skew things or not view things the same way as others do. So that can be a difficulty in that those self-reported tests. And lastly, there are a few objective measures in this, in all of these studies. So I think having a few more objective measures could make these studies much more credible. So next I just want to transition into our conclusions. So as we've stated earlier, there are a majority of the studies that conclude that the Mediterranean diet may have a protective effect against the cognitive decline in older adults. So not all of them stated that, but the majority of the studies found that the Mediterranean diet may protect against cognitive decline, such as dementia or Alzheimer's disease. In addition, evidence suggests that many factors play a role in cognitive function and decline, not just based on the diet, but that is a huge modifiable factor, but there are many other factors that can affect cognitive decline, like we've discussed, such as having the ApoE4 allele, also obesity, sedentary lifestyle, hypertension status, hypercholesterolemia, diabetes, age is another one, and being female. And to close, I just want to talk about a few implications for further research. In my opinion, more research should be conducted on young and middle-aged adults on the effect of the Mediterranean diet on cognitive health across the lifespan. Since we're doing so much research on the older adults because of the aging population, which is important, but we should do more research on the young and middle-aged adults as well to see if the Mediterranean diet could have other protective effects in the future. In addition, further research using more controlled variables may gain more credibility. Since these studies do not contain many controlled variables, that does dilute the um, credibility quite a bit, but overall they were decent studies. So all in all, thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I hope you guys have a great day. If you have any questions, you can contact me. Thank you.